Batman and Superman meet the anti-Superman. What does that even mean? Okay, so what this story does is this picks up in an alternate universe version of Gotham City, which is technologically advanced and it looks really, really cool. But the funny thing about this little bit of a story here is that this basically mirrors the story of Superman, and that's something that's going to become important here in a second. That within this alternate reality version of Gotham, the world's basically coming to an end. So much like the story of Superman, this kid is put on a rocket ship and sent away. Here's the big difference between this kid's story and the story of Superman. When Superman was sent away from Krypton and he arrived on Earth, that took place within the main DC universe itself. When this kid's sent away, he actually ends up traveling through the multiverse and arriving in the main DC universe itself. Now, when he arrives here, of course, his ship is intercepted by Batman and Superman, and then they basically bring the ship back down to Earth. Now, a couple things to explain here. Number one, this kid starts talking about Hypertime, and two, what in the world is world's finest, and why are Batman and Superman teaming up? All right, to the second question, Batman and Superman teaming up in the world's finest comics have been a thing ever since the old world finest comics back in the 1940s. Batman and Superman were just the most popular characters that DC had, so DC said, let's put them in a book and have them team up, and they've basically been doing it off and on ever since, and it just makes good sense from a business perspective. To the first question, talking about the idea of Hypertime, this is a ridiculously antiquated concept that DC has only recently tried to make sense of in John Stewart Emerald Knight #1. So you guys know how sometimes something takes place in comics and it leads to an alternate reality? A really good example of this is in the Flashpoint storyline when Superman lands on Earth but is immediately taken by the federal government and then held underground, exposed to a red sun constantly so his powers never develop. That's a whole different alternate reality. What John Stewart Emerald Knight #1 did in explaining Hypertime is it said sometimes there are changes that happen in the time stream that are not enough to create a whole new alternate reality, but are different from what goes on in the main DC universe. It just kind of fits in there, right in between. Now, why DC's doing that? I don't know. Hypertime needs to go away. It's unnecessary. DC created it after they got rid of the multiverse in Crisis on Infinite Earths as a way to basically tell stories that could kind of be multiversal stories, but there's not really a multiverse, so there's no multiverses to tell stories about. It's weird. It's unnecessary. They need to get rid of it. The important thing here, though, is that Hypertime being what it is, it was studied by the people in Gotham City in this alternate reality, specifically the parents of this kid. Now, the funny thing here is that this kid, whose name is David, basically says that the idea behind the rocket ship is it was going to be an experimental vessel, that it was going to be a vessel that was going to be sent through the multiverse in an effort to explore the multiverse itself. That's something that DC's been doing ever since the events of Dark Crisis. The multiverse is back. It's bigger than it's ever been. There's more alternate reality Earths that are around there, and even some old realities have basically come back. So DC's been doing a lot of exploring on that front within DC Comics. And so while David was only on one vessel, there were supposed to be others. But with the world coming to an end, they basically turned the vessel into a life raft and then sent him away in order to survive. Now, the reason why this is so important is because David's powers immediately start manifesting as soon as he arrives here. And quite literally, his body just starts generating massive amounts of heat and just let off this massive explosion. And so there's two things that happen here. The first is that Batman and Superman deduce that David being exposed to the yellow sun, that much like Superman, basically starts setting his powers into overdrive. But with him not knowing how to handle his abilities and not even fully understanding what they are, he presents a clear and present danger to basically everybody around him. But the other part of this is that as he tells his origin story to Superman and Batman, Superman realizes David's story is almost exactly like his own. And so there's a kind of kinship that forms between the two of them, because in a lot of ways, Superman sort of wishes there had been somebody that he could talk to in order to understand how he can fit into the world. Such as it is, he never had that. There was no one Superman could go to basically help guide him and make sense of his time here on Earth and how his powers are working and so on and so forth. There was no mentor. And so Superman sees himself as a potential mentor for David. And so Batman, of course, as you guys know, is always skeptical of everybody. And so he's literally looking at this kid, David, like, something's a little off about this kid. I should do some detective work and figure out what it is. And so while he's doing that, Superman takes David to the bottled city of Kandor. Now, for those of you guys who don't understand this mythos, the bottled city of Kandor has been part of the Superman stories for decades. And the idea behind this really just goes back to a guy named Brainiac, that in the early days of DC Comics, when Brainiac was originally introduced, his big MO is that he would travel around the universe and he would capture entire cities and then shrink them down and bottle them up. And so Kandor was a Kryptonian city that was shrunk and bottled by Brainiac before Krypton was completely eradicated. Superman eventually discovered it, and the origins of how he discovered Krypton have been retold over the years in DC. But within Krypton are just a whole host of Kryptonians. And so by bringing David to Kandor, it allows the Kandorian scientists to actually study David to better understand how his powers work, and even devise a suit that would allow him to control his own abilities. And so following that, Batman chimes in and says that he's found David's parents. Now, this is kind of a messed up moment in the comics, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I kind of laughed a little bit, but it's also twisted at the same time. When Batman and Superman bring David to where his parents reside in this universe, Batman initially tries to warn David of something, but David doesn't listen. He immediately takes off and goes to see these people, and he just kind of grabs them and hugs them and says, "It's me, your son. I haven't seen you in so long," and that kind of a thing. And they immediately get angry, right? And that leads to David basically taking off because from his perspective, his parents don't recognize him. Now, that's when Batman chimes in and says, what I was trying to tell you is that, yes, these people are this reality's version of your parents, but their child died like years ago, right? When he was just like a toddler, that kid died. So you running up on them and telling them like, I'm your long lost son, kind of disrupts the healing process that they were trying to go through. And it just seems like a crazy, terrible, evil thing for a person to do. But it's one of those things where he's kind of told, your life as you know it is more or less over. It's basically done, which is a pretty crushing experience for this kid. And this is one of the reasons why Robin is one of the best characters ever in DC Comics. Because what ends up happening is Robin just kind of sits down and says, this kid needs some normalcy, right? You guys are basically trying to teach him to understand his situation and so on and so forth. What he needs is to believe he can fit in somewhere. He needs to believe that he can find some measure of a home here. And so what he does is he takes him to meet the Teen Titans. Now, here's the thing. The Teen Titans, right? Like, I mean, they've got some dark stories. Don't get me wrong. The Teen Titans have some dark stories in DC Comics. I mean, some terrible stuff has happened to this team. But they're like the most fun ever. Like, if I were a teenager and I had powers, the Teen Titans is like the first group I'd want to go hang out with. So it's one of those things where, like, when he's brought to the Teen Titans, it's basically Robin and the gang saying, hey, look, come hang out with us. Now, the Teen Titans are really cool in this way because they have their own history. The Teen Titans was originally composed of a team who were all basically sidekicks of the bigger superheroes. Now, over the years, they've developed a massive audience. They've become immensely popular. But what we also end up finding out here is there's a much bigger game afoot, that behind the scenes of all this stuff is a villain known as the Key. Now, we'll talk about him here in a second because he is arguably one of the most powerful villains that you've never heard of, and I love what DC's doing with his character. But initially, David hanging out with the Teen Titans, it just looks like the most fun ever because what they're doing is like testing his powers, like how fast can you move, right? So like Speedy, who was at one point the sidekick of Green Arrow, like fires off a boxing glove arrow, and the idea is to like catch it or dodge out of the way or something like that. Ultimately, he just gets hit in the face. I mean, he doesn't end up like destroying it, but like he also kind of gets hit in the face, that sort of thing. But in a lot of ways, what the Teen Titans realize is that his powers are just reacting instinctively. But more so than that, and one of the cool things about this here is that while David doesn't necessarily know it, the Teen Titans are kind of putting him through a training regimen, figuring out how his powers work, figuring out how his mind works, how stable he is, that kind of thing. It's a pretty smart way to get an understanding of where this guy fits into everything. Now, the bigger problem here is that while he should be spending time with the Teen Titans, of course, there is a kind of emergency that's taking place here. Now, the funny thing, and this is something that I absolutely loved, when the Key is brought in, who's the one behind this big emergency, he's almost kind of brought in as like a ridiculous villain of the week and not someone you would take serious. Because as his name suggests, the Key is able to like unlock and lock locks, right? Control access to different areas. So this guy basically locks down the building and then initiates these emergencies across the city. And there's like no firemen to respawn. And he's like, if you want your city to survive, you will give me $5 billion in untraceable currency. I mean, it's the least interesting plot ever. It's kind of cool, I'm gonna be honest, right? A guy who can just like shut down people's ability to access doors. But Batman and Superman swoop in quite readily and start evacuating people, and the plans of the key go up in smoke pretty fast. But what's also interesting here is that David is just sort of thrust into the situation, right? He's just sort of brought into this whole thing, and his task is to basically try to help people, save people as best he can. Now, he's not familiar with this, and in fact, what he's told is that there is a mine out there that's basically been shut down, but within this mine is methane gas, and the miners cannot escape because of the actions of the key. So the job of David is to travel to the mine and basically find a way to get the door open so that these miners can survive. The problem with this is that, as most of you guys know, methane gas is highly flammable, and with David's powers being that he just lets off massive amounts of heat, the potential issue here is walking into a methane gas-filled chamber with a lit match, right? You're gonna blow yourself to pieces, and you're gonna kill everybody and everything in there. And in fact, that's David's concern, right? Where he initially tries to unlock the door using an emergency latch, it doesn't quite work. And then in turn, he's told by Batman, you're going to have to smash the door down, right? You're gonna have to use your powers and blow the door apart, but you have to be precise. Just enough of your powers to get the door to unlock, but not so much that your powers accidentally blast into the room and blow everybody to smithereens. And in fact, David actually panics and bails, right? He freaks out, and he ultimately ends up abandoning the whole thing and taking off. Now, the cool thing about this is that he basically starts to kind of look inward and even reflect on his own history with his parents, the world falling apart, the world basically dying, everything ending, the fact that he fled from like helping save the life of a guy who needed his help, and in seeing himself as a coward, ends up traveling back to the building and in fact tearing the door apart. And then in that moment when Superman arrives to basically get the door open where David couldn't, he ends up finding that David has the door open as well. And so in the face of the Key's plot, right, his entire scheme basically coming to an end, that what he ends up doing is meeting with his partner, the person that we didn't actually know was working with him behind the scenes. And what we find out here is the partner of the Key is none other than the Joker. And as you guys know, the Joker realizes that David is basically the new sidekick of Superman. And anybody who knows anything about the Joker knows just how much this guy loves sidekicks. Specifically, he loves to kill them. So here's the question you gotta ask yourself: what happens when it comes down to Batman and Superman having to fight the Joker? Because I will tell you guys this much, things are about to pop off. But with that being said, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.